Welcome. This series of videos is about assuming agency and steering one's own life. It's primarily aimed at younger people or people that haven't considered these matters deeply as of yet. You'll find nothing new in these videos. People have been thinking about these issues for ages, but in every new generation, for every new media, it needs to be restated in the modern idiom. And that's what's happening here. If these videos don't make sense to you or they don't seem to speak to you, that's okay. You can just move on. You'll find these things stated in many ways by many different people. But if it does resonate with you, then you are the person that this is aimed at. Throughout the series of videos, we'll be using the metaphor of the captain. And that metaphor is drawn from a poem by William Ernest Henley. And I guess without further ado, I'm going to read that poem to you now. The title of this poem is called Invictus, and it's fairly well known. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. And yet, the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. So that was Mr. Henley's poem. And we're going to pause now to give you a few moments to reflect on it, and you can replay the poem and listen to it again should you wish to do so. So I hope you've taken a few moments to reflect on the poem Invictus. You might be tempted to think, well, what he's talking about is fine and good, but he doesn't really understand that I've had a tough life and that it's just not that easy to take control if circumstances have gone against you. So I want to speak a little bit about who Mr. Henley was and when he lived. He was born in 1849 and lived in 1903. Medical science wasn't as advanced in those days as it is today. And Mr. Henley had tuberculosis and complications of tuberculosis. At the age of 16, one of his legs had to be amputated, and it was from those complications. And then later on in his early 20s, it looked like it was continuing in the same vein, and they were going to have to amputate his other leg. He went to a hospital and had a kind of state-of-the-art at the time medical treatment, several operations. They were hoping to save his leg. And as he was in the infirmary, recovering from some of these operations, not sure whether or not his one remaining leg would be taken, that is when he wrote the poem Invictus. So Mr. Henley experienced some tough times, and it helps us to understand what he means when he says, in the fell clutch of circumstance I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance my head is bloody but unbowed. going to speak to you now about a couple of Stoic philosophers, the two most famous Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. These two gentlemen lived in the days of the Roman Empire. They were quite different as far as circumstances go. Epictetus was a slave. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. He ruled the entire Roman Empire. So their circumstances were quite different. Marcus Aurelius could command the ships in the army, sail wherever he wished in the Roman Empire. Epictetus was bound in his master's lodging. He would only be able to go outside if his master permitted it. So from an external point of view, their circumstances were quite different. Philosophers can argue about which was the freer, Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, and you might be able to develop your own opinions on that if you end up reading these two philosophers or reading some of the histories, for instance, about Marcus Aurelius and some of the things that he went through in his life. It's by no means an obvious answer. I'll give you a couple of quotes from these two gentlemen. First of all, let's start with Epictetus, just a little short sentence of his. This is from the Golden Sayings of Epictetus. No man can rob us of our will. No man can lord it over that. So this is the slave that was saying that. He's saying no one can rob him of his will. Kind of a curious thing for a slave to say. And here's a little quote by the emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Hippocrates, after curing many diseases, himself fell sick and died. The Chaldei foretold the deaths of many, and then fate caught them too. Alexander and Pompeius and Caius Caesar, after so often completely destroying whole cities, and in battle cutting to pieces many tens, thousands of cavalry and infantry, themselves too at last departed from life. Heraclitus, after so many speculations on the conflagration of the universe, was filled with water internally and died smeared all over with mud. And lice destroyed Democritus, and other lice killed Socrates. What means all this? Thou hast embarked, thou hast made the voyage, thou hast come to shore. Get out, if indeed to another life there is no want of gods, not even here. And then he goes on. But you can see even the emperor maintained a healthy respect for what outside circumstances could do to one. I'll give you another quote. I'm going to give a lot of quotes and references to people from the past, many of them from the olden past, because their thoughts and sayings have stood the test of time. And you'll find many modern things of this nature also. The next one I want to give, though, is a little more recent in time. And this is from a fellow that was interred in the German concentration camps in World War II. His name is Viktor Frankl. Most, or perhaps all, of his family died in the concentration camps. He survived. And he wrote a number of books after he got out. He's fairly famous. But this is a quote from one of his books. It's called A Man's Search for Meaning, or Man's Search for Meaning. Mr. Frankl says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms. To choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So Mr. Frankl's words, after that experience in the concentration camp, echo the words of the slave Epictetus from many centuries before. The sense of agency, the sense that you have the ability to control, even if the outside world and circumstances are imposing conditions on you that perhaps you can't control. You can't control those conditions, but there are things you can control. That sense of agency tends to comfort many people. Some people get nervous in a car if they are sitting in the passenger seat and someone else is driving. And a lot of that isn't due to the difference in skills of the driver, but it's in the ability to control the vehicle. The driver has the ability to control, the passenger doesn't have as much ability to control and therefore gets more nervous. Sometimes an illusion of control is put in place in order to placate people. And in the times that I'm living in now, there are a couple of illusory buttons that you can push to give you the idea of control. One, when traffic lights were being put in, initially there were buttons that a person could push that would activate the light and stop it, and then a light would come on for pedestrians to cross. Later on, those were found to interfere with the synchronization of traffic lights across various intersections, and many of them were just turned off. But the buttons were left in place. So people could walk up to the crosswalk, push the button, and feel better that they were actually controlling the circumstances, even though the buttons no longer had any effect. And many, many of those at this time are still left in place, having absolutely no effect. Some of them still work, but more and more of them are just put there to make people feel better. A very similar thing is a placebo button in elevators. In our modern society, there are some regulations that on how long elevator doors have to stay open, and they're related to the ease of access for handicapped people, etc. Nevertheless, there is a button on most elevators that has arrows indicating that the button, if you press it, will close the door. Nowadays, at least in the nation where I am, the United States of America, most of those buttons don't do anything. You can push them as much as you want, but the doors are still going to close at the same time that they would close anyways, because there's other factors that are governing when the door closes. Nevertheless, the buttons weren't removed because people feel better pushing that button and feeling like they have some control over their life. So the Stoics, the Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, recognized that it was important to distinguish between elements that one could control and elements that one couldn't control. No use giving yourself a lot of grief over things you can't control. You just deal with it and then exert yourself on the things where you can exert effective control. Now, of course, the puzzle is making that distinction and figuring out when you have control and when you don't have control. In the case of the examples I've given you before, the buttons on the elevator and the buttons at the crosswalk, it's not at all evident. And in fact, sometimes there may be some use in pushing the button. It may be a traffic light where they have still kept the old system in place, and it actually does turn on the pedestrian signal. So it's by no means easy, but that's the task before the Stoic or anyone that wants to assume agency, is to figure out where control can be exerted effectively. In the case of a captain of a ship, for instance, as one steers towards a port, a storm may come up and blow someone off course. Well, the storm is outside of your control. Perhaps if you make an unwise choice that you're not going to pay attention to any doggone storm and you steer into the middle of a hurricane, your ship may be destroyed. So distinguishing between those elements where you're going to control and where you're going to live with it and then exert your control where you can always retains its importance. The assumption of agency is by no means the only way to run one's life. Many people cede command to somebody else. Perhaps they find a spouse that will give them directions to their life, or maybe their sergeant in the military, or perhaps their boss at work is the one who essentially directs their life, or it may be maybe it's the universe. A counterpoint to the approach I've described that the Stoics took is given in a Beatles song called "Tomorrow Never Knows." I was going to play you a little bit of that, but I think there may be some copyright issues or possibility of the videos getting taken down if I play a verse of it. So I'm just going to tell you the lyrics here. So the song starts off: "Turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. It is not dying, it is not dying. Lay down all thoughts, surrender to the void. It is shining, it is shining." So that's quite a different approach to life, to turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. And it's not necessarily any better or worse than the approaches that my video series is going to describe. It's just a different approach. And who knows, it may be that for a given person at times it's appropriate to assume agency, and there may be another time when it may be beneficial to lay that agency down for either a short period of time or forever. So those are decisions for the individual. I just want to draw your attention to the differences. Now, there are even different approaches to, quote, going with the flow. The Beatles spoke about one way of dealing with the river, which was to turn off your mind, relax, and just float down the stream. I want to give you another example of going with the flow that's a little bit different. And I learned about this one when I was on the Snake River from a man that ran boats up and down the river. And he showed me a place on the Snake where the Native American Chief Joseph had crossed the river. Chief Joseph was leading his people, and pursuing them were the United States military, the United States Army. So he was a bit ahead of them. They needed to cross the river. And his scouts located a place on the river where you could drop something into the river, and the current would take the stick or leaf or whatever it was and take it over to the other bank of the river. So he had his people cross at that point. The other bank, it was a place that was fairly easy to get out also. So he sent his people and their livestock and everything into the river at that point. The current pushed them over to the other side of the river, and they were able to get out. No loss of people, no loss of livestock. Everyone crossed just fine. They were not observed in the crossing, and the pursuing army then realized, oh, hey, they got on the other side of the river, we're going to have to go after them. And they did. They crossed at a different point, which didn't have those peculiar characteristics, and they suffered considerable losses in terms of livestock and people crossing the river. So this is just a counterpoint where Chief Joseph was obviously going with the flow. He carefully considered the flow, and he used it to his advantage. However, by no means did Chief Joseph turn off his mind, relax, and float downstream. And in fact, that would be a fatal error in many places on the Snake River, because you wouldn't survive just floating downstream in many places. So just throwing that out as a possibility that even going with the flow, there are different ways to do it. So this series of videos is aimed at the people who have made the choice to assume the command of their soul. And assume the responsibilities that go with that. That's not going to be everyone, but if it's you, then you might gain something from the other videos. The next videos are going to focus on general elements that anyone who's assumed responsibility for their soul should profitably address. You leave these elements out at your own peril. Now, how each person addresses those elements is going to depend upon your particular circumstances, the times you live in, the tools that are available to you to do that, and your own needs and wants and proclivities. And those factors are constantly changing. So the way that you do these things is going to have to change. The important thing to remember is all of these elements need to be addressed, and you need to not forget any of them. So in the series, I'll give some particulars, some things that I found to be helpful in my life in addressing these different things, but those should be just viewed as examples from a giant menu that may or may not be relevant to you. The examples may or may not be relevant to you. You may choose to pick something else off of the menu. So that is the close of video number 1, assuming the command.